everyone, and welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project. So you're with myself and Blake and a very special guest today. We have Alicia Edge from Compeat Nutrition. And so Alicia has a pretty significant bio. I'm probably only going to mention snippets of it, but we'll let her introduce herself as well. But she's worked with the Matildas, currently working with the Jets. Correct me if I'm wrong. Previously was working at the AIS. So has extensive knowledge in all things sports dietetics, which is awesome. That she also has her own podcast called the Compeat Waffle. I was actually listening to one of your episodes this morning just to give myself a little bit of a buffer for some of the topics that we're going to cover today. And it kind of made me think that the first question that I sent to you is probably has potential to go on for hours. And then we've got plenty of other questions to cover as well. So we'll see how much we can get through today. But it's going to be a really good chat, I'm sure. So welcome to our podcast, Alicia.
Thank you so much, guys. It's always a good thing when you're already talking about part 2 before part 1's even recorded. So I will just clean up like what I've been into. So yes, currently working as the nutrition lead for Football Australia. So my main role is within the female pathway of that. So looking after the nutrition strategy for Matildas mainly, and then also leading the development pathway nutrition strategy as well between the future Matildas, junior Matildas and young Matildas. And then additional to that, I'm a tech startup founder. So we noticed a very big problem when it came to the sporting structure, but also nutrition provision when it came to athletes in the sporting space. So we wanted to move away from the consult model, particularly in nutrition. It's so behavior focused that we really felt like the consult model wasn't giving what it needed to when it came to the support that athletes, but also the general population needed when it came to going, okay, food, the stuff that we're going to talk about in this podcast is very science centric, but eating is a behavior. And so how do we actually go, all this science is great and it's really interesting and we love it as scientists, but how do we ensure that it's actually valuable to the people we're working with? And so I left the AIS in 2015. I'd been there for 4 years and it's been such a crucial part of my learning, my career. And man, I just learnt by osmosis during that time and worked with some incredible sports and of course some incredible colleagues as well. But when I left, I was now a new mum in a little town called Foster, a little bit north of Newcastle.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
it was awesome. It was a great lifestyle. But we moved there for my husband's work, and about 6 months after having Barb, I was like, what now? Like, what does my career actually look like? Because my options in terms of career didn't really make sense to where I'd been. So, I was looking at hiring at a room in a physio clinic or a GP center or working in aged care. And although I love all that stuff, it didn't make sense financially, but it also didn't make sense to my career pathway that I wanted, but it also committed to in that 4 years that I'd been at AIS. And that's when my incredible husband, Dan, who's also co-founder of Compeat, stood his ground. He's like, this doesn't make sense. I'm not accepting this as your career pathway. It's also not fair that you're not able to accelerate your career pathway just because we're in this location for my career. So let's do something different. There's no reason why in nutrition you have to be in the room with someone. So what tech is available? And this was in 2016, 2017. So it was quite early days. Telehealth wasn't really accepted there yet. And so we started playing, and we started to play with a dashboard initially, which could really translate some of those things that we're looking at achieving with our athletes via technology. And now we're in that app build phase after all the testing's been done. So it's a wild ride. It's a stressful one. I would do it again. It's been amazing. I've been filled with so much purpose throughout my last 4 years of working in this, but man, not for the faint-hearted, very much a different way of focusing on who I am as a healthcare professional, but also really high risk and just high stress. So, sure. Yeah, that's kind of us now. So Compeat now works with Melbourne Victory alongside Football Australia, Lacrosse Australia, alongside some endurance sports. So my background is very much in endurance. So when you said this podcast can be endurance focused, that's my love. So that is absolutely all good, even though I am very heavily in team sport at the moment.
Yeah. Really what endurance? Running, triathlon, cycling, bowling?
Yeah. Primarily running and triathlon for me personally.
Yes. One for the good guys.
Yeah, and very much working in cycling a lot of the time with pro cyclists as a professional. So I love cycling. My family did a lot of cycling, but I ended up kind of cycling within triathlon rather than it being my only sport. So I love endurance in the way that there's so many complexities and individual things that change. And I think in some sports, particularly like team sports or power sports, you can get away with not necessarily paying attention to details, but it's not until you enter endurance sports that those things can't hide anymore. And so the intricacies of nutrition really get to play out, and there's some really cool stuff that we can impact. So I think that's why my love of endurance is still there.
Yeah,
it's such a funny area, isn't it? The endurance world. This is something that I learned really quite recently. I did the Port Macquarie half Ironman, and leading up to my dad has no idea about anything. He's like, oh, you must be like eating really, really clean and healthy and all those things. I'm like, I've never eaten so like unhealthy in my life. I feel like just so much sugar and white bread and just stuff like that. So it must be such an interesting area, challenging so many misconceptions that are out there about what is fueling for endurance sports.
Yeah, it's a really tough one because it depends on what background someone has with food and diet to how they then are able to fuel. And, I always envisage like nutrition in terms of a bit of a triangle where, you can be in the center of that triangle aiming for, a bit of body composition, performance, and also, health. But sometimes you're moving that dot to one of those aspects. And so at the cost of other things. So in endurance, like if you're looking at how to eat or fuel, there's a need to move away from all of the health behaviors around food or what you would consider that clean eating way of eating to ensure that you're able to fuel enough, fuel effectively, and actually be able to absorb and tolerate all of those foods as well, because energy needs are just so high. And so it's the same with body composition. And one thing that we see quite often is if all our eggs are in one basket of aiming for a certain body fat percentage or a certain look or weight, it comes at the cost of health and performance often as well. And so sometimes and often why we move the conversation away from body composition is because sometimes it comes at the cost of what you're actually looking to achieve or who you want to be.
Yeah, I remember when I was like 19, I just started off gym based. I did a little bit of running, but mostly gym. And I was just like that typical gym guy, gym bro, more so, just doing arms and chest as much as I could, eating horribly. And I remember for a couple of weeks, I tried to eat like 650 calories a day of just carbs and protein. It was horrible because I just thought if I just lose it all quickly and then I can just maintain, like
makes sense.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And just no idea at all. But talking about that, like I was just focused on body composition. Like I was ready to sleep 16 hours a day as long as I was eating less. Like the health side of that triangle I was way away. I didn't even get abs or bigger biceps, so it wasn't worth it. So anyone out there, it's not worth it.
Absolutely. I often use the example of, the figure competitions where if you're looking at their goal of complete body composition, like that's the one extreme of that spectrum, they're at their worst health state as they walk on that stage in all aspects. They may have achieved the body composition, but in essence, they've gone through a very rigorous, very strict, very, like there's a lot of trauma within those experiences to get to that point at the cost of their health and their performance, really.
Yeah. I guess that sort of takes us to our sort of first topic or first question of RED-S and low energy availability. I imagine that they would probably be in a pretty strong state of that.
Yeah. So when we're looking at RED-S, so if you're unaware of what RED-S means, because that is a really weird word to hear out of talking, like, what are you talking about? What color are we talking about here? RED-S stands for relative energy deficiency in sport. Now, sometimes and in some conversations, I really wish that sport didn't exist in REDS because I have definitely seen it within a multitude of people who don't necessarily identify as athletes, but have energy intakes that are well and truly suboptimal and below what they need to cover the cost of their living, their lives, their metabolism, alongside all the actions they're doing and movements they're doing per day. So it's basically when we're not meeting that cost of activity alongside the cost of what our body needs to thrive, when we're looking at our metabolic needs, whether that be our organs being able to function, whether it be our hormonal pathways, alongside our mood, our gut health. And It used to be called female athlete triad. So if you've heard of that, then it's very similar in terms of the concept, but really bringing in that overarching syndrome, both to the male and female athlete, and also encapsulating a lot more of a syndrome where it doesn't need that really particular, bone density issue alongside menstrual cycle dysfunction. It actually has that whole of athlete approach that I really like, where symptoms can be different depending on the individual, but it's always something to have at the forefront. So it can impact lots of things.
Yeah, it's a systemic issue. It really isn't it? It's definitely not just picking out the bones and the menstrual function. It's everything.
When you're talking about, and I'm just going to pull this stat out, I hope that it's wrong, talking about like the basic metabolic costs, your body needs a certain amount of calories just to function at a baseline. And then obviously when you add exercise onto that, it increases the calorie intake that you need. So, and I know people that, let's say they go out for a 20K run and their watch says that they've burnt 2,000 calories, they'll just eat that amount and kind of forget about what the body actually needs. And I've heard a statistic, it's like the brain requires 20% or 20% of our carbohydrates go to the brain or something like that?
It's actually more, and it's really like if you're looking at the base, the brain really takes up 20%, but it uses a whole lot more of that energy. So when we're looking at those symptoms that we're screening for in all our athletes and all our players, and I wish it was done more frequently, but we're trying to make headway in there with both our tech and also the way that we've set up our programs, is that we do see mood disturbance. We do see, for those in the support pathway networks and practitioners in this space, you might be picking up changes in mood. You might be seeing some irritability, some loss of focus, concentration, distraction, all of those things, which are all brain-centric, and you may actually not pick up that, there's something underlying there. And it's not saying that those changes are always due to LEA, low energy availability, but they can be a really big piece to bring into the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely multifaceted, but just understanding that, you need to eat just for a baseline for you to just function as a normal human being without any exercise or any movement, and then eating and fueling for that on top. It's incredible. And I think of, I use a Whoop and it tracks my calories, and Kelly and I always compare that, some days if I ride in the morning and run in the afternoon, it's sometimes like 5,200 calories or 4,500 calories. And I think to myself, I'm a pretty big guy as well, and I eat it quite a lot anyway. And then I would track them just to see how I would go. And sometimes I'd only eat like 3,500. I wouldn't even be close. So I can imagine people will definitely underfuel. And this is obviously the result.
Yeah, and intentional and also unintentional, exactly as you said.
It can absolutely be accidental. So there's three main reasons that we see that lead to low energy availability. So that intentional is when you're intentionally seeking out an energy deficit to achieve usually a body composition goal or a weight making sport, those types of things. The unintentional are things like that are often unthought of. So things like being unable to afford the amount of food that you need to fuel your sport, alongside time availability. So some really interesting studies that were done by a colleague of mine, Bron Lundy, in heavyweight rowers. So these guys are over 100 kilos, big guys, but their rates of low energy availability and therefore the syndrome of REDS were actually quite high and surprising because of their training load over the day. These guys were training 2 to 3 times per day. And the result of that was actually there was just not enough opportunity to eat over the day to cover the cost of that training. So it was unintentional, it was accidental because of environment pressures rather than anything else. Accidental can also be very similar to what you were saying, Kelly, where you haven't changed or adapted your food intake to suit the change in your training load. So if you've got a very, say, clean, I hate that word, but I'll use it, people know what I mean, clean way of eating, where, you're choosing lots of fruits and veggies and color and grains that are really high fiber. First of all, there is a fiber threshold that our body can tolerate. So if we're increasing our energy intake and as a result also increasing our fiber intake a lot, that can interrupt that hormonal pathway in our estrogen levels. But also as a result of that clean eating, we actually get really full. And so it's nutrient dense food, but not energy dense food. So we might feel or perceive ourselves eating plenty. We're like, I'm eating heaps. I can't see how I could be in an energy deficit. but because it's so filling and also there's a really big volume of food, you just accidentally don't cover that cost of your training. Now, the third reason that we see, it's accidental is very actually very often.
Was that, if I've got that right, like going over your fiber threshold, you know, it can interfere with like your hormonal balance and estrogen release. Is that right? And then obviously makes you feel
and also
full.
The uptake in the uptake in the absorption pathway, like in the gut. So it's really intriguing. The evidence is still coming out in terms of what that threshold is, but generally, if we see a fiber intake over that 50 to 60 grams per day, which is actually pretty easy to get to. I know when I was training for Ironman, and you know, it was the early days, Reds wasn't even a thing yet. Showing my age. It was I was easily getting 60 to 70 grams of fiber per day, and I had put myself into Reds due to, you know, I was eating volumes of food. I'd come to work with my shopping bag, but I was just eating too well and not having those high processed high energy.
That's incredible. I'm pumped up. I love learning stuff like that. Like, that's such an easy thing to happen and people just have no idea. And then when you think about it, there's no way you're going to think, oh, it's too much fiber because this is why. Like, awesome.
Because the health information is absolutely, like, according to the health information that we're getting from social media and, you know, government or all those things, it's just not, or influencers, gosh bless them, is that we need to have more fiber. It's that we need to eat clean. It's that we need to have fruit and veggies, but there is a balance, and, you know, too much of a good thing in this case. The third one almost kind of bleeds into that clean eating piece, which is disordered eating disorder. So when we're seeing what leads to low energy availability or that risk around that, there can be disordered eating behaviours that aren't necessarily diagnosable in eating disorder, but can absolutely be things that we all screen for and keep in front of mind when we're chatting to our athletes or active individuals. So clean eating is one of those, because it leaches into that orthorexia, so that fixation on healthy eating, healthful eating, foods being good or bad, and those types of behaviours and also languages around food. All the way through to restrictions, skipping meals, and you know, moving through to things like purging. So purging can actually be through what we kind of initially think of, which is vomiting, but it can also be exercising to earn or burn food as well. So that is actually...
I've done that. I know, I've done that plenty of times. I did that last night, probably, training this morning. No, but I've done that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because I think what we think of when we think eating disorder is that we think this often white privileged teenage female that's underweight.
Yes, and like anorexic, making yourself, and it's not,
Yeah, but in reality, that's only a very small percentage of what we actually see in disordered eating disorder, particularly in sport. Generally, what we actually find is it's those types of behaviours and anxieties around food that lead to some stress, anxiety, distraction around our food decisions. So when we're looking at eating disorder and like normalised eating, or like optimal eating, if you like, it doesn't just become from optimal eating to eating disorder. It just doesn't happen overnight. There are some cases that happen very fast in certain circumstances, but generally it'll build into what we call disordered eating. And this is where, if we can pick it up early, we can move it back to optimized eating much faster at a much more efficient rate and a much better experience for the athlete than if it goes unnoticed into a diagnosable eating disorder. So things that you might notice in that disordered eating piece seem really small, and sometimes they're actually really normalized in today's diet culture society, where it's almost celebrated. Oh, wow, they're so structured with their eating. They have so much motivation. They're so dedicated. Look, they're weighing their chicken at Nando's. Like, wow, they've got scales with them. These are the types of things that we hear. Or also coaches, going, oh, wow, this is one of my most dedicated athletes. Like, he never has anything off his menu. He weighs everything, or he measures everything, or he tracks everything. And it's like, I can see why you celebrate that behavior, but in reality, what are we actually celebrating? And there's different, it's not saying that everyone that does that is disordered, but it can be something to have on our radars as practitioners, no matter what area we're in, where we don't have to be the ones to provide the informational solution to these things, but we can all be part of the ability to screen and make sure and check in with our athletes that they're okay.
Yeah, and like diet trends, I feel like that's probably a really common one that we probably see, because I mean, a lot of the patients that I see, I do one-on-one like strength and conditioning programs or rehab programs, so I get to know them really well, and often a conversation of diet comes about, and they'll ask me like, oh, what are your thoughts on like intermittent fasting or the keto diet or things like that, because they typically are, you know, I guess motivated people who want to get better and perform better and look better, I guess, or whatever their goal is. And I was learning about or listening to what was it? Maybe it was a course that I was doing, and they were talking about the diet trends being so different for athletic populations versus non-athletic populations, and it can actually be very, very detrimental in athletic populations. So I guess that's one thing to flag and recognize, but this is a very loaded question, sorry. But also, what is your general thoughts on a lot of those diet trends?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of my role is distracted by the diet trends. I spend a lot of time spot fires, putting them out, about like just ensuring that our athletes, our active individuals feel knowledgeable and confident enough to know what's right for them or what will suit them. We, you know, for the last 30 years have had ongoing diet trends. It's, you know, if we look at it really in the terms of generation sense, all of our athletes and players have actually grown up with diets in the home a lot of the time. We also have a fixation as humans to do new. We love new things. We love fun things and interesting things, and doing, you know, daily habits and boring stuff is actually not all that exciting. It doesn't really have a name. As religion changes as well, there is a need as a human to belong, and sometimes that belonging is through a type of diet or something you can label and identify as. So that is definitely something we have noticed, is nutrition definitely has a very strong relationship to an identity. It's something that you'd put in your bio even, and so that can definitely shift the conversation. Now, in terms of where we stand with diet trends, I always work first by getting to know the person, what works for them, what's their commitment like, their capacity like, what's their history like when it comes to their relationship with food. It's very rare that different ways of eating will, in the extreme sense, work for many. It's a very 0 to 110% approach that has a lot of friction pieces along the way, whether those frictions be based around, you know, time available to create or shop for those different foods, the expense of those different foods, alongside the social, emotional, cultural connection to food as well being impacted. So the short-term piece of that is that most of those things will work when they're looking at how do you define work? What does success look like? And if success looks like changing weight in the short term, you know, we will definitely see an energy deficit that leads to weight change because of the restriction. But because of all those friction pieces, and if we're looking at behavior change and relationship with food, they tend to be shorter term. Now, it's not to say that it doesn't suit everyone, but we will use some of these things strategically in performance nutrition. For example, fat adaptation for the ultra endurance athletes can be a very effective way to improve their ability to perform at lower intensities for really long amounts of time. But in terms of the performance sense for, say, your endurance athletes all the way up to Ironman, the intensities that are required for those types of races actually ensure that we do need carbohydrate in. So fat adaptation has a place. Periodization, where we're feeling for the work required, has a place, but it's strategic. It's done when people have a really positive and strong relationship with food first, and then it's done. So, you know, one of the reasons why we changed and adapted and built tech differently is because I was so frustrated that I was finding out all this cool stuff in terms of the science of food and nutrition and performance nutrition, but I was never able to actually enact it because I was spending all my time on that base level of either it being improving the knowledge and confidence and capacity of someone with their food and nutrition and shopping, cooking, that kind of thing, but also in ensuring that they have a really positive relationship with food and body first. So then I'm able to do the fun stuff. But yeah, it's It's a big one. I don't think I'll ever overcome it, but
it's
it'll always
so
be around.
complex. It's incredibly complex. And I always say to Kelly, you know, we really wanted to, I guess, people listening to this to be able to you know, generally screen to be like, hey, you know, you probably do need to see a dietitian, or, you know, we've identified some factors, especially go and see the guys at Compeat. It's really, really complex, like everything. But I just think that just goes to show why, you know, us as clinicians really shouldn't be giving too much advice. Like, I've worked with a dietitian the last 2 years, and basically they said to me, the only advice that I can give or recommend is just point them to the 5 food groups, you know, the national dietitian, the pyramid. And I know other clinicians that try to give advice on nutrition, but just listening to you there, it's just so complex. And it's not just, just eat more and just eat this. Like, there's so much to go into it. And I think I'd be really happy if people listening to this understood that you guys do so much more than just, you know, work out how many calories they need for their run, if that makes sense. There's so much more you're addressing. So, which kind of leads me to my next question, and one I'm really excited to hear. A general consultation with yourself or anyone from the Compeat team with someone that we identified that we have suspected LEA or suspected REDS, how does that run? And then what's kind of the follow-up? I mean, we know it's not just eat more and you'll get better. There's so much more to it. How would that generally run, or the timeline of that, I guess?
Yeah. In those specific examples, when we're looking at concern, maybe they've been injured a lot, maybe they continue to be sick, maybe all those different symptoms that we've already talked about are coming across. And you're like, I just want to check in on this. I just want to see if there's something more there. I get a lot of questions, particularly from physios actually, asking the question of like, but like, if we're not counting calories or if we're not recommending a certain amount of calories, then how do they know they're eating enough? And my biggest pushback to that is that, first of all, I think as clinicians, our place isn't to prescribe numbers like that. It's a very dangerous and very free-fall place to be, where you don't actually know the background of that person that you're giving numbers to or prescription to. And I use the prescription very strongly and firmly in the way of that's exactly what you're doing when you're prescribing certain numbers like that without a background. And prescription has a place for particular things when it's necessary in my line of work, but most of the time we're empowering behavior. And so the biggest piece before, like you might suspect LEA or they might be showing symptoms of REDS, is the first initial thing that we do is really work through what's actually leading to that. We want to know the cause. We don't want to just say eat more, train less, because, for example, if that's from not being able to afford food, that's really poor advice, and it's actually not going to create any progress at all. It's actually going to create more friction, anxiety, and stress on that person. If, for example, I go, this is easy fixed, eat more, train less, and there's someone with an eating disorder who's their main way of coping is actually to overtrain or do extras alongside restricting their food, you know, it's not a great coping mechanism, but it might be their only one right now. That's, again, a really poor thing to be recommending. If it's accidental and, you know, the main areas that we need to work on are more knowledge around food and switching things up, then, you know, the progress towards being in energy availability tends to be a smooth one. But often what we will need is changes and edits to the training program, and that's where we work very collaboratively with the whole team, alongside needing to gradually refeed those athletes to a place of energy availability. So to give you a bit of an idea on some of the numbers, if you're interested, energy availability isn't calculated on a energy equation as such. It's based around going, how much energy do we need per day for my body's metabolism? How much energy do I need per day for how much exercise I'm doing? And how much is left over. So it's literally how much energy is available for my daily needs. And if the amount of energy available after we've accounted for training is less than 30 calories per kilo of fat-free mass, it is really in that state of low energy availability that we start to see those changes to how someone is functioning, how someone is performing, and then also the long-term health risks of that as well. The ideal energy available per kilo of fat-free mass is 40 to 45 calories per kilo of fat-free mass. So it's a really big
general population or athlete?
Athletes. This is very specific to athletes.
Cool.
But I must tell you, it's actually really applicable to the general population because an energy availability question literally just looks at activity. And so the general population really, as a minimum, if they're not doing any exercise per day and they know their kilograms of fat-free mass, they can just go 30 times kilos of fat-free mass, and that is your minimal that you should be aiming for. That is like not even optimal. The optimal amount of energy that someone should be eating per day, even if they weren't to do any training each day, is 40 times your kilograms of fat-free mass. Easiest equation that you can go to. And then you're able to go, okay, well, what else do I need? I'm fidgeting all day, I'm moving all day, I'm walking, I'm exercising, I'm training, and that can all go on top of that. But if you're doing that calculation in your head, I can assure you most of us will not go below 1,400 to 1,600 calories. That is, if you're doing that calculation and you have been on a 1,200 calorie diet, I can assure you, you are well and truly in suboptimal energy availability. And people say to me, well, if I'm eating, if I don't eat below my metabolic rate, then how do I lose weight? But they've missed the point. The metabolic rate and how much you need to eat all day to sleep all day is just one part of the equation. You can absolutely still cover the cost of that while still being in an energy deficit. It's not saying you can't lose weight. You can do it while not putting yourself at risk of those suboptimal things that I think all of us have experienced. And you mentioned, like, all those things you've experienced when you've put yourself into a really heavy energy deficit where you do lose energy. You might stop fidgeting. You might stop being able to think and make decisions and concentrate. You might get gut upset. For the male side, I've been really remiss not to mention this. I apologize. A recent paper 2 weeks ago, very recent. So one of my colleagues, I've already mentioned her name. I love her. I'm a bit of a fangirl, Bron Lundy. So she's the Rolling Australia dietitian and she did her PhD.
I've got her name down here.
Oh, did you? Amazing. Yes. So Bron actually just has been doing her PhD trying to find a way to screen for low energy availability in males. Because I know.
Finish it.
Yeah. So the low energy availability in females is screened at the moment called what we call a leaf Q. Now, it's been done mainly in endurance athletes, so we definitely need to look at those results with a little bit of context when we're working with, say, something like team sport, but it's well-founded. It's a really great tool. It's validated. What we don't have is a lean Q, so low energy availability in males questionnaire. So Bron had set out for the last 5-6 years, a long time anyway, to find a way to validate a tool. And she's just published a paper, the attempted validation of the lean Q, because it was extremely difficult for her to validate this screening tool. What came out of it, though, is the importance that we start having more ready conversations about erections in males and morning erections in particular, alongside libido. So even though we will definitely see changes in mood disturbance, gut function, all those types of things, one of the main things she found was really that conversation around asking around morning erection was one of the most predictive measures of working through where that state of low energy availability is at for the male and also the risk of that. Now, we've come a long way in talking around menstrual cycle in females and normalizing that conversation. And now I see this next phase being very much around focusing, all right, how do we normalize the conversation in male athletes to be around talking around this? So, watch this space, but it's exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible. And like we've said this on the podcast before. I've heard Renee McGregor say something similar, and I found it myself because I was saying this. I actually had a lady yesterday, and she's actually doing a PhD in Newcastle in nutrition. I can't remember the topic, but we were just talking kind of about this podcast and things like that. And you actually know someone that works for Compeat with you, but can't remember her name. And we were just talking about, myself being a male and seeing runners and triathletes and things. Initially it was very difficult for me to have the conversation with females and saying, do you have a regular menstrual cycle? And I know Kelly and I have both seen and screened patients, and we've seen the same patient and heard different things from different patients. Like they're very open to Kelly, not open to me, which I completely understand. But I can imagine it as a female and even as a male as well, it's very hard to ask another male, how many morning erections do you get per week? It's pretty confronting, but it's so pivotal to their health. Like, you've got to ask these questions. Like, you're in this consultation to get better and improve. So yeah, don't miss that. I really like that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think there's lots of questions that have come out of this paper, and I'm really excited to continue to have the conversation with Bron around what her thoughts are, because I think the really interesting thing about something like menstrual cycle is it is quite medical. It's quite prescriptive. We can easily kind of ask the question, by the age of 15, have you started your menstrual cycle? It's like a yes, no answer, right? But then where does the line blur between what age we can start asking around morning erection? You know, I would be very concerned if a 16, 17-year-old male didn't or had issues here. But I don't know if that's even something I can ask an under 18-year-old. So there's lots of questions that are now emerging in my mind of like, there's lots of things I need to, you know, start to map out of like, this is kind of given more questions than answers, but I'm really excited with where it'll take that conversation, but also awareness and importance for male athletes.
Do you have any advice on how to do that? Because I'm just thinking of myself, like, and I'm an only child. If I'm sitting there in an appointment with my mum and this lady's asking me about how many morning erections, I'd probably die. I think I'd explode.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's uncomfortable enough for, you know, as we talked around the menstrual cycle, you know, as a 16-year-old girl, I was always like horrified. I was like, oh my God, we don't have to talk about this.
Yeah, talk about something else.
This is really uncomfortable. Yeah. I think there's a place for something that we've been doing and really exploring is the screening tools that allow someone to answer these questions in security of their own home in a personal space where there isn't that confrontation of face-to-face. I think there's absolutely always going to be a place for face-to-face, but we have seen some really great stuff come out of being able to be comfortable in your own home with these very vulnerable questions to consider how you respond, but also the safety and response. But, you know, that's not necessarily the answer. But I do agree. I think being really mindful about when and where and how safe that environment is to ask these questions is really important to consider as a practitioner for sure.
Is that the LEAF Q? Was that the LEAF Q, that questionnaire? Did you mention?
LEAF Q is the female one, and LEAF Q
is the new one. Yeah, cool. Awesome.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was doing with one of my colleagues, Joe, a presentation a few weeks ago to the Newcastle group of runners. And I was talking about RED-S and training considerations for female athletes. And there was males in the room that we were talking to as well. And there was a question towards the end of, you know, how do you identify RED-S in males? And you know, I said, look, monitoring a morning erection is an option. And everyone just giggles and laughs. It's just like it's really like a taboo, untalked about topic, and it's weird and different to say out loud, and even a group of grown adults just giggling at that, which, you know, it is kind of, I guess, funny, but it's also a very serious thing to think about as well.
Yeah, and I really am grateful. Some of the male athletes in the endurance space, triathlon, running, cycling, that's generally where we'll see LEA risk be quite high, alongside the weight-making sports where leanness is either needed for performance or to compete. The coaching, and I'm very grateful for some of the coaches I've got who actually bring this up when they refer to us, is I've had this conversation, they're concerned about libido is another way to ask this question. Have you seen a change in your libido? Has that reduced recently? If that's the start of the conversation, that's a really good place to be, both for females and males. I think sometimes we always think, oh, well, I need to ask the males the libido question. That is just as relevant and just as important in the female population as well. When we're seeing disruptions in those sex hormones, we will absolutely see disruptions in menstrual cycle, but you will also see changes in libido as well.
Yeah.
That's good. How do you come out of LEA? Like, is it all RED, or is it like a long, like 6 months? Like, obviously I assume that it would be periodization where you slowly build up your intake and monitor your training. Like, how does it happen?
Can I just quickly add something to that as well? I really liked what you said before, Alicia, about, you know, it's not as simple as just telling someone they need to eat more, train less. And it's something that we've often talked about on this podcast. Patients don't need to just hear facts. Like them hearing facts sometimes just puts up a wall. You need to get to the depth of it and understand and empathize with them about where they are, why they're there, and where they want to get to. So I think that's really, really important, and a really powerful message for people to hear. And Yeah, sorry, that Blake, what you just asked then, it triggered that question or that statement.
Well, I think it's also, they're both really related. Throughout university, for all the practitioners that are probably listening, we had a very prescriptive focused approach to how we work and how we should approach clients and patients. However, the more I work with people is the more I realize that prescription isn't the best approach most of the time. Prescription has a place, but it needs to be primarily client-led. And I always push back when I hear, oh yeah, we're client-led as, health professionals. I think a lot of the time we're not. I think we've got a really long way to go before we are truly client-led, in the way of a client being able to be the true, I guess, expert in their own life, first and foremost, and us standing beside them rather than continually being over the top of them, prescribing what they need or should be doing. We are potentially going to be able to be so much more trusted and also efficient and effective in our roles if we take the time to, and I appreciate that there's a privilege in being able to take the time in the current model of healthcare. I think that's a very broken piece, I guess, as well, where we don't have the time within consult settings a lot to actually take the time to know our client, know where they're at with their readiness to change, to be able to then change how we approach that person to where they're ready. So when we're moving away from prescription, as you said, and most people know that they might need to eat more veggies, or they may need to drink more water, or they may need to eat more, if that's the whole thing. If LEA is based around not eating enough, then it makes sense that we just tell them to eat more or train less. However, that's not behavior. That's the goal, but it doesn't actually translate into those actions that they need to be doing each day. So the research is still very new when it comes to how long does it take to recover from RED-S. There's been some initial studies in the last couple of years which are really exciting to actually show time kind of pressures, because I'll be upfront with you, there are athletes that I've worked with that are not ready to achieve energy availability, particularly when we're talking about it being a result of training load alongside having disordered eating or eating disorder. It's very difficult to achieve energy availability if there's no readiness to change, because that is extremely uncomfortable. If you're talking to someone whose whole career has been based around hearing the message of you need to be smaller, you need to be leaner, you need to be less, eat less. The messaging that they're then getting from someone like myself is extremely foreign and very uncomfortable. And there's also a risk to change of weight. And if someone's identity is caught up in what they look like or what they weigh, the risk or the discomfort in then hearing, I need to eat more, which I could then actually see a change in my weight, that's going to be met with some resistance. And so the recovery from RED-S isn't necessarily linear, and it's not easy. And I will be first to say I haven't had full success because of that discomfort. And some athletes simply aren't ready. And my job then becomes very focused on just allowing them to take the time to start to notice, start to contemplate, start to weigh up the pros and cons. It's not even about food yet. It's really just allowing them to start to notice and really see where they want to be. The recovery time can take, I've had anything from 1 to 2 months onwards from a year. Like it does take a bit of time, how long that menstrual cycle in females has been MIA for. I've had an athlete that is in their late 20s who has never had a menstrual cycle. So for me, I actually don't know what the answer is. We don't have the research. And so all we need to try and do is start to refeed. Now, that actual refeed process will be very dependent on that person that we're working with. Some depending on, like if weight's not a sensitive topic, if they've got a really strong relationship with body, we will actually aim for energy availability pretty quickly. If they're not concerned about any change in weight, if they're really ready just to achieve energy availability and they have a really strong readiness to change, we can do that quite quickly. But for most, particularly if they're still competing in their various sports, even if they're not weight specific or weight sensitive sports, they will generally need a gradual refeed with a lower risk of changing just due to body image, performance pressures, all those types of things. So gradual is generally the way we'll go with most, but the really fast return to EA is also an option.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I wish I heard this 10 years ago, not 10 years, 5 years ago. Yeah, it's great. It's just, I know so many people, and I was pressured, I was going to ask you towards the end, you basically just answered it there. What do you do for someone that's so performance driven, then also body composition driven, and they're like, I want to really do well. I want to run this 10K, I want to do this Ironman as quick and as good as I can and train so well, but I don't want to go over 80 kilos. I can't do it. I'm really body sensitive. Sorry, I'm very body sensitive. Oh, that was a mouthful. It's just incredible because whether which way you manage it, obviously performance is the key, but there has to be some leeway there. If you don't want to eat because you're worried about putting on weight, you're probably not going to perform as well. And that conversation is very tough to have. And convincing someone, so I know when I was younger, if someone said that to me, just like you said, you need to eat more to perform better. It's like, no way, I don't want to put on any more weight at all. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's really hard. And particularly because sometimes we're trying to do that without the support of coaching and support staff. So you'll have coaching and support staff giving a particular athlete, I will say cycling is because cycling is a broken system. If you're working with cyclists, there is a really strong pressure for leanness and power to weight. And it's very disordered and normalized disorder. And so sometimes we are trying to achieve this while on the other side they're getting really mixed messages. And so that's another challenge as well, where the importance of that cohesive multidisciplinary team is like best practice and the ideal, but in a real world scenario that is often something that's so conflicting because the support staff don't have yet, hopefully that'll change, the knowledge around RED-S to actually feel comfortable with that whole messaging of telling a player or an athlete to eat more. To them, they're like, you don't know what you're doing. That's a ridiculously silly idea. We need this person lean. How dare you tell them to eat more? And because it feels uncomfortable to them as well as uncomfortable to the athlete or player, that's a really, really tough discussion to have.
Yeah, and for some people, it's
what are some questions that? Sorry, Blake. What are some questions that we can ask, like regarding their nutrition, to generate a referral to you, particularly on the topic of RED-S, which is what we've been obviously talking about? Yeah,
I really encourage questions that are a little bit more invitational. Adding the start of the sentences of "have you noticed" is a really good strategy to use. So, have you noticed yourself getting more sick than those around you, or more often than is usual for you? Have you noticed yourself being injured more often or more severe, particularly with stress fractures? That's like a warning sign straight away. Have you noticed that it's really hard for you to make decisions, or have you noticed that you're more irritable around loved ones lately, or lower mood? And if those questions continually are coming up with, oh yeah, that's me, then I would definitely say a referral to either a sports-specific doctor to start, or to just even get a review from a dietitian is a really good place. As a sports dietitian, I don't just look at what someone's eating, I look at their training load as well. If you look at, there's no point in me changing all of their nutrition if actually they need to be changing their training load as well. So for me to understand how much they actually need to eat to reach energy availability, I really need a great understanding of what they're doing each week, and if there's extras in training coming in, or if there's earning to burn mentality and all those types of things. So they're the types of things that you can absolutely ask without having the pressure for yourself to solve those, but still having that invitation to start the conversation.
That's good. Earning to burn is a good little analogy. I've just filled up this sheet with some great bites for to release. There's so much. There's too much. You're too knowledgeable. There's too much education here.
Is reducing training load always necessary in managing RED-S and LEA, or is there an option around for the athletes who don't really want to take their training load away? Is there an option to just try and fuel like more around training and in general, or is that not going to be effective if they're in a really deep well?
Yeah, so it'll be twofold. When you're looking at the IOC, so International Olympic Committee return to play guidelines for Red-S, there are different categories where it goes green, amber, and red in terms of what that return to play looks like. In that red bit where it's looking at very severe reds alongside disordered eating disorder tendencies, then training needs to be looked at in terms of load and what that actually means. For the elite athlete that has gone into reds for various reasons, and maybe it's just leaning into disordered eating, we can generally adapt maybe a little bit of training. Mostly it'll be food and nutrition related to return to EA, as generally lots of opportunities to do that, to be honest, because they may just have not been able to be cooking or shopping enough. They may not be able to afford it. So we're working on those strategies, or we're fueling the sessions more. We're teaching them how to eat before and after, or eat in the car, and all those types of things that can increase that opportunity to eat. But yeah, it can, to be fair, it's probably both. It's also really looking at what kind of training that person is doing. If you're looking at a sport similar to, say, CrossFit, I know this is kind of endurance focused, but if you're looking at something like CrossFit where there's a lot of high intensity, high load sessions going on, that can be one of the first things to try and adapt so that, they're still able to do their strength training, but maybe we would look to reduce that high intensity training a little bit. In endurance, we're looking at total load in terms of kilometers and time, but also the intensity of those sessions as well, to see if we can ease those back. So there's ways that athletes can still train while adapting their training sessions to put them in a little bit more of a better place to return to EA than just kind of going, do as you always were with your training and let's just try and do something with food.
Yeah. Is it true that when you do eat in LEA, I've got that analogy down, I love that. Sort of analogy, whatever you call it when you shorten a word. When you're in that, let's say you are eating 1,600 calories, is it true that your base metabolic rate can then change and become lower? Is that right? So if you can somehow cope for 6 months and it'll stay there, and then you've got to actually eat more than what you think. It doesn't just stay stable for 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah, it's actually the base cause of the symptoms to do with reds. So if we're looking to diagnose reds, it's actually through testing basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate. That's how we can diagnose in the lab. So all the studies that have been done in terms of looking at reds is done with a metabolic cart in a lab setting, particularly at AIS, and Swiss has one. So I've definitely used those with athletes where we're unsure or we need some numbers to get a little bit more buy-in from the support team or from the athlete. The metabolic testing is very, very useful. And what that measures is how much energy they're using in terms of their kilograms of fat-free mass and where that's at. So we'll see so if you can imagine, what can I give it? A low power mode in your phone, right? So you've got your phone fully all the time, but once you get below that 20% on your phone, it goes, ooh, I'm really lacking in energy. I need to find any opportunity to make this energy go further for a longer amount of time. So I'm going to dim some of those apps. I'm going to stop checking on data as much. I'm going to lower the screen lighting, all those types of things. So that's your basal metabolic rate going low power mode. And so that's where we see those changes in gut function. So it's using less energy. Think of your body as being more efficient. Now, I think more efficient sometimes has a positive tone to it of more efficient. That sounds great. But in the body's metabolic sense, it's efficient in terms of using less energy to do whatever it has to survive. So your gut function reduces. Yeah. Gut function reduces, your brain function reduces, your sex hormones all reduce, so that that pathway of sex hormones stops. So you lose your menstrual cycle, the libido, the morning erections, those types of things. So it's all about conserving energy, and that conservation of energy is where we see that drop in metabolic rate, where if you're an athlete, you're still going to be doing all that training you're doing. So that's not going to come from the budget. That's going to be a continual. So it needs to find that budget from somewhere else, and that by dropping some of those non-essential or at least dimming the switch on those non-essentials.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, I'm conscious of your time, Alicia. So, and I also have a patient as well. So I have to do a runner.
Wait, I wanted to ask one more question. One more minute. Do you know anything about turmeric?
Yes.
Yeah, my patients tell me this all the time. Is it true? You need like 2 kilos of turmeric to get the anti-inflammatory benefit. Is that right? Or it can be a little bit.
If you would eat it by food, you would be having to work very hard to get the amount of that anti-inflammatory. It's not to say you don't have turmeric. It's a really excellent thing to add to your daily intake, but most of the time we'd be leaning towards using a supplement for that reason to get that amount. Yeah. Sorry, I just switched back getting all my notifications. Curcumin is one of those supplements that's classified as Group B. So it's got some emerging evidence, would have potential. It's not classed as Group A where it's like definitely use, great. It's just this could help. This has potential. More research is needed, but it's also do no harm, which is low risk. So yeah, that's one thing. But maybe we do an whole injury session.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, definitely keen on a part 2 for sure.
All right. And so just quickly, they can find Compeat Nutrition on Instagram, website. I mean, we're obviously going to plug you everywhere we possibly can, because you're awesome and incredible. But to find you anywhere, Instagram is probably the best bet, the easiest to get to. And then they can obviously see your website straight from there on the.
Yeah, spot on. Beautiful.
Awesome. Lovely. Thank you so much. Have a lovely week.
So nice. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks, Blake.